What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello everyone again, and welcome back to Faith Undone. It's another beautiful day in Southern California, and I'm in my office right now with my daughter. She's doing some work in the back, some homework, some artwork and things, and I'm still trying to kick this cold, so I'm going to get it. Hopefully next week I'll have it done. This past week, I had an opportunity to talk to some people about the podcast, and they've listened to it, and they've actually, a couple of them had listened to it all the way through, all 17 episodes in basically one sitting. And they had some great questions for me. They said, one of them said, what's your goal with this? And I thought, that is such a good question. And so here's my answer. There are hundreds of podcasts that are deconstructing faith. They're all out there from a humanistic perspective to an atheist to a Christian to whatever. They're all deconstructing Christianity, the Bible, faith in general. But there are few of them that are actually doing any real reconstruction. Because again, when you leave that tradition or you leave the idea, what do you begin walking into? It could be very lonely. And so this is what I mean by this. I picture the deconstruction of faith almost to look like a kid with a hammer, standing in front of the stained glass window, of a church or whatever. And the kind of windows, those windows that often darken a room. Sometimes they'll have images of angels or Bible scenes portrayed on them. Well, this kid, as he learns and outgrows certain pains, he begins smashing them. And I picture he's just smashing them to tiny shards. Nothing left but this empty space there. So I would argue that's often how many of us, when an old idea is deconstructed, we feel like there's this huge loss, there's this big empty space. But what if, while the windows are being broken, there's also a plan in place to take that glass and melt it down, reshape it, build something that works, create an image someone can enjoy. Some of the glass will obviously be left behind. It may not have any place anymore, but some of it can be reshaped, reused, and placed in a new framework for people to enjoy and find meaning and purpose. And this is how I see Faith Undone, this podcast. We're learning to be honest in what we see, willing to deconstruct, but also go beyond and build a new framework that we can walk in. So today, I want to reframe the way we viewed a book in the Bible, one that is I would argue, the most misused, misunderstood book in all of Scripture. And so for the tribe I grew up in this Christian sect that prided themselves on their interpretations of this specific book. And they'd essentially felt that because of their specific math equations and various patchwork of historical events and faith in a certain historical figure's messages, they have it figured out. And I would sit through hours of seminars where they would bring out these pictures of beasts and these sexy harlots and time charts, and they would use these to demonize the Catholic Church and the Pope and make predictions of Jesus, the coming again and making some historical connections that I would argue only the most elite conspiracy theorists would understand. And so it was an interpretation that brought a lot of fear, and it placed all of the trust, all the power, all the control on that specific sect and their way of interpreting it, their Kool-Aid. So I remember there was always a new date chosen for this big event that would happen. In our tribe, 1844, then 1900, then I remember even my graduation day, 1999. I remember people even telling me, and this is how crazy it gets, folks. Some of you that don't know this tradition, this sect, you're going to be like, what in the world is he talking about? I remember that I had family members tell me, you know what, 1999, your graduation, it's not going to happen, man. Jesus will come and he'll zap away all the bad people and this and that, and you'll go to heaven. So I mean, don't even plan on going to college. That's how crazy it could get when you misuse this book. And so 1999, it came. A day in which will not be remembered for the second coming of Jesus. It'll be remembered for Prince's song 1999 and all the fears of Y2K. That's what we remember about 1999. Many of us have had similar feelings about Revelation. I've even had some people beg me not to do a series on this because it's just, there's so much baggage with it. But I think with anything, when there's baggage, when there's an issue, when the thing needs to be deconstructed, we don't walk away from it. We pull out our hammers. So in this series, we're going to deconstruct a misused book, reconstruct meaning for it today. And we won't be using ridiculous graphs and charts and conspiracy theorist predictions. We'll use history and our brains. We'll research to find the actual context, which will take away the fear and the guilt out of this book, all the crazy predictions of future events. We're going to leave that behind. So first off, it's interesting that many theologians, they didn't actually enjoy this book either. Revelation was a book that barely made it into the Bible canon. And much debate happened during the Reformation, which was made about dropping the whole thing entirely, this book. Thomas Paine once wrote this: "It's a book of riddles that requires a revelation to explain the revelation." Isn't that awesome? And Martin Luther, he wrote this: "This book is neither apostolic. I can in no way detect that the Holy Spirit produced it." Again, they are supposed to be blessed who keep what's written in this book, and yet no one knows what it is, to say nothing of keeping it. Jesus is neither taught nor known in the book. Luther, I think this is interesting. Luther had no use for this book until it served his purpose in calling the Pope the beast of Revelation. And then that in turn made caused the Pope to call Luther the Antichrist. That's where that whole tradition came from. The Catholics being called beastly, the Protestants, the Antichrist. That's where that whole tradition came from, by the way. So I believe Revelation is actually the most misused, mistranslated book in Scripture, but I also believe it has a beautiful message to share. It's one that I think probably fits with the Jesus message for Christians today. It's actually one of the most relevant ones. Yet it takes some work to learn what it means without using your decoder rings. And so this book, understood within the right framework, is actually really gritty. It's filled with political cartooning, jabs at the system, the man, right? It's written in the popular writing style of that day, not some ancient style that no one understood then. They understood it. This book is actually like the political monologues of Colbert, John Oliver, Trevor Noah. This book is really powerful, and it's really sarcastic and gritty, political cartooning everywhere. Now, this book is many things, but there are some things this book is just not. So first and foremost, this book, it's a challenge and a comfort to people in the first century living under Roman rule. And it answers the questions: how do we live a part of a culture but not be a part of it? How do we live in this culture but not buy into some of the ideas and things happening, right? It's also apocalyptic literature, which was very popular at that time, meaning it's unveiling a concept, a truth, not predicting future events. So it unveils the truth about what this kingdom that Jesus spoke of, what it looks like, how to live it in the midst of a kingdom that doesn't work anymore, one that is I would argue really beastly. And so it also answers the question of who is truly worthy of following. Which emperor, which rule, which kingdom is worthy of following? So this book, again, it's not a puzzle needing to be fit together to find geopolitical dates and people and places. Not it. If you've been using it that way, you've been misusing it. It's not a book to scare people into submission. It's a book written in poetry and narrative and liturgy, with political satire and imagery that culture would have understood immediately. So let me put it this way. If you haven't picked up on this yet, let me put it this way. Brian Zahn, hilarious guy. He's got some great material out there. He gives this metaphor, and I want to share it with you. Imagine a picture of an elephant in Victorian garb holding a teacup. And next to the elephant is a donkey, which is like kicking the elephant. And on the side of the elephant is written GOP. So for us today, we'd understand the political cartoon, the GOP, what the donkey and the elephant represented. But to people 2,000 years later, we'd be a little confused, wouldn't we? These people had an elephant, an animal called Gop, and it was with odds with this other animal, so much so that they like printed their conflict everywhere. We'd be confused. We'd be doing some serious stretching if we didn't have much information to go on, which is what we do to this historical book. Because this book, during Rome, all of these symbols, they meant something. So for people living in the first century, they understood these images. Babylon was Rome to the Jewish nation. That's what they called Rome. Anything Babylon was a system that was bad, it was evil, it was oppressive. So much of Revelation is a resistance to the emperor and the Roman authority calling for these people, this early movement, to worship their power, their dominance, worship things that did not fit their morality and their ethic. So John begins using this style called apocalyptic writing. And again, nothing to do with predictions. And so here's the thing. They're writing a style that uses imaginative imagery centered around symbol. So if you called out Domitian by name, you'd be murdered. But if your writing is of a dragon, like a lamb-like dragon that uses language that's lulling people into compromising ethic and morals, you can get away with it. It was actually deeply subversive. So here's the thing. Let's grab our hammers and let's start breaking some window panes. So here we go. First off, the author. This book, according to a long tradition, many people believed it was like this Apostle John that wrote the Gospels. But most scholarship today says that's actually not the case. John was a super common name during that time era, especially for Jewish people. So John the Revelator had a very different style, grammar, and voice than the gospel writer. So understand that. So what we know for sure about this John is he was someone who lived in the province of Asia, and he kind of brought trouble wherever he went. We know he had this rival in the city called Thyatira, who he considered to be this false prophet, actually calls her Jezebel, right? Jezebel, someone who moves people away from truth. And so we know that he's exiled to the island of Patmos because his teachings were, just like Jesus, stirring up the politics and the economics and the religious structures of Rome. So John, the apostle that spoke in the Gospels, probably not it. Also understand this. The cultural context is everything. So it's extremely important to understand first century Rome. At this point in time, this Christian movement is very tiny. It's made of people living out this message of a new way to live. And they had just gotten through the worst persecution under Nero. But this new emperor steps in. And while Nero was this sociopath, he was intent on killing everyone, Domitian, he was more concerned with spreading his claim as God all over the world. So while there was some persecution, it wasn't as nearly as bad as Nero's time. And Christians actually who took Jesus' teaching seriously, during Domitian's time, you didn't see as many murders, any of that. They would, though, periodically get investigated by government officials, because they weren't sure who these people were. They actually even thought these Christians, were terribly unpatriotic because they actually called them atheists because they weren't worshiping all the gods. They were actually harassed by trade guilds, because if you don't pay homage to the emperor, then you can't participate in the trade. In fact, what's really interesting about that is that Domitian, he required when you walk into the city and you're going to trade, he had all of these different altars set up. with incense. And so what you would do is you would actually light the incense, and then you'd put that on your hand. You'd mark your hand to show that you have paid homage to Emperor Domitian. Again, like some of you have read Revelation, been beaten over the head with it, you're already like, mark of the beast. Yeah, that actually meant something to those people during that time period. Not something you look toward thinking you're going to get some chip put in you or whatever. No, like it was actually something that you marked, and then you could participate in trade. And those people during this time period, those early Christ followers, they were saying, we don't participate in that because we don't believe the way of Domitian is what brings life. But for most of the real issue was that the Christians in many of these small home churches, they were beginning to do what the Jewish nation did during the Babylonian rule. And here was the biggest issue for them at this time period. They were getting too comfortable. Let me say that again. They were getting too comfortable in exile. This was a group of people that had just survived some of the really the most violent, disgusting events you could possibly imagine. I mean, many of their people ended up murdered and then their heads placed on poles in Nero's garden to light walkways. It's that kind of persecution they went through. They survived it. But now things have calmed down a bit. And this new leader named Domitian, he comes into power. He had a new gospel, and his reign was going to bring real peace. And the reality was he was doing some good things. He was bringing peace among many of the different groups, yet he is still Roman. Still same Roman values of power and oppression. Still valued the things that this tiny group of people were attempting to do differently. And so what do? Even though you may not be as directly affected as you used to, those same issues, those same moral choices, they're still there. They just may not directly affect you anymore. So what are you called to do? I want to share with you a couple statistics I find interesting that I think may end up being part of the conversation. The clothes you wear. Did you know that the cost of clothing is continuing to plummet, yet the demand for it continues to increase? And some of you may wonder why. Well, here's the thing. The world clothing and textile industry, that's like clothing, textiles, footwear, luxury goods, all of that, it reached over $2 trillion in 2010. And that statistic is 7 years old. And according to some, has gone up 2 more trillion now that we've gone past 2016. So at the same time, though, what's happening around the world is we're seeing child labor overseas has gone to insane proportions. More than 300 million children today are child laborers, and an estimated of 210 million they're engaged in hazardous work. So over 90 million of these children are below 10 years old. Highest number of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So they're producing goods you and I are buying. What do? It's not directly affecting us. But what do you do when you know that thing isn't right? Those statistics aren't good. We're consuming so much, and it comes at a cost, doesn't it? Our vegetables, fruits, meats, almost all have these terrifying pesticides used in order to produce enough to cover the mass production need for Americans, who statistically, by the way, throw away half of it. Consuming at the rates we're going, it's actually hurting humans, animals, and the planet, and yet, for many of us, we're pretty good at ignoring it, aren't we? I want you to even just think about the planet for a minute. This miracle of a world that gives us life daily. Just think about this. The United States makes up less than 5% of the population on Earth, yet we easily consume over 30% of Earth's resources. 5% of the world, taking 30% of the resources on Earth. If the number of cars, here's another one, if the number of cars keep increasing at its present rate, there will be over 1 billion on the road by 2025. There's currently around 700 million cars on the road today, producing 900 million tons of carbon dioxide each year. So that actually, it equals approximately 15% of our total output So sadly, one half of these trips in the US are within 3 miles and could easily be walked in less than an hour. What do? A single quart of motor oil dumped on the ground or in the trash can contaminate, I was blown away by this, can contaminate up to 2 million gallons of fresh water. A large study has found that up to 1/2 of all plants and animal species on Earth could face extinction by 2050 due to global warming. So according to the World Resources Institute, 100 species will die each day due to tropical deforestation. What do? How do you respond? Here's the thing. You've heard tons of these statistics. I know you've heard these. You've heard about human trafficking, the waste, the deforestation of the forest, the effect we've all had globally as well as nationally. You've heard this stuff. And yet for so many of us, if it doesn't directly affect me, then I don't care enough to move from my comfort, do I? I'm happy where I am until I'm directly affected. And so the truth is, for many of us, we fall prey to this daily. And so John, this political, religious prophet, right, starts using this metaphorical language, and he smashes the windows. So this prophet, by the way, not someone making weird futuristic predictions, wielding time charts and such, but a prophet. The idea of a biblical prophet was someone that shared messages of hope and challenge. So the prophet takes the hammer, smashes the windows, and makes some noise. So when you look at chapter 1 of this book, in the first chapter, he says some interesting things. And I'm just going to kind of summarize a little bit. You can read on your own. He starts by writing this. It's a revealing of the Christ. It's a revealing of the deeper message and its implications for us. It's a revealing of this kingdom Jesus spoke of. And again, it's not a revelation about future events, crazy literal beasts. It's not a revelation that helps us pinpoint who we think is evil and bad and this and that. It's not it. He uses language which was popular during that time, referring to often the emperor. So here's some things he says, some words that were actually really famous during that time period. The word Son of God. Almost every emperor said they were the Son of God. They believed they were a deity on earth, and they were sons of the gods that sat, get this, on the right hand of the gods. So they were given dominion. The phrase, the beginning and the end, often used in reference to the emperors. All of this, and specifically all of this, are references that Emperor Domitian uses for himself. So, in the tradition of the great writers, John makes his connection. He says, Christ is the King. He is the way that leads to life, the one sitting on the right hand of God, the beginning and the end. This Christ message, this is the message that rules, not Domitian. And this, by the way, if this had been very open messages and not been in this kind of literature, he would have been easily murdered immediately. So then he begins describing the divine, the mystery of God. We could say the new kingdom as being among us. He describes this, which would imply that they had forgotten the kingdom. If you have to be reminded of it, then you've most likely forgotten it. You see where I'm going? So this book is going to be a reminder of the things that have been forgotten. It'll be a wake-up call to people to open your eyes to the world around you, the good, the bad, the ugly. It will allow you, like the ancients of that time, to see your place in the nation, in your city, in your community, and have you asking questions. What kind of power do I have? Should I align myself with this power or that power? What stuff do I participate in, and what do I not? Is there some issue of politics, environment, human rights you've purposely avoided because you felt it didn't directly affect you? Because if there is, maybe it's time to start doing some research. That pair of jeans you purchased at H&M that's so inexpensive, it's actually inexpensive for a reason. That produce that you bought at that price is that price at what cost to your health? That homeless person on that same corner every morning on your way to work is homeless for a reason. They actually have a message they can share with you just by being homeless. The mom and pop stores are fading away in your city. And that Costco's presence, it actually means something far more than now you can buy more bulk potato chips. There's a message there that is being ignored. There are things you can choose not to participate in. You can actually have far more power than you realize. I would challenge you to consider the everyday things a little closer, because you have far more power than you realize. You can make a huge impact simply by choosing not to participate in some things. So, what will you participate in, and what will you begin resisting? What will you spend your energies doing, and what will you choose to say, that doesn't bring life, and I don't want to be a part of it anymore? What will you begin resisting? Blessings, everyone. And we'll see you next week. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. And again, if you found this helpful, please visit tonywerfel.com and go to my Patreon page. Give a one-time donation or monthly. Help us keep this thing going. Blessings, everyone. Have a great week. Bye.